So when I proposed this idea to Bruno, he thought it was a really good idea because I think so many people here are really kind of trying to figure out what's going on with AI and so forth. And the more I started writing this talk, the more I realized it was a very personal journey. This was me against AI and what I went through. My journey here was, remember way back, 20 years ago, back in 2022? At least it feels like that, when we could actually talk to this new thing called ChatGPT. You could basically ask ChatGPT to ask a poem about UXLX in a pirate's voice, and it would do it. It produced a really horrible poem in a pirate's voice, and it was so cool and amazing, and we were having so much fun. We were like kids splashing in puddles. It was this fun little thing that we could do, and now just a few years later, we're like, really? Is this what's happening? And there's this dread, this sense of frustration that's going on. And so this is kind of my journey because I kind of felt that way at first and I was trying to make sense of it. So the problem I had was that when I was starting to talk about this and explain it to it, I ran into so many unbelievably happy people that were so into this AI, and I was just like, wait a second, am I taking crazy pills? This stuff is doing crazy stuff, and they like it. They're doing synthetic user research. That can't possibly make any sense, can it? And so I'm like, what's going on here? And on top of that, not John, but other people were actually quite arrogant about it because when I'd say things like it's not working, the universal answer is, oh, you must be prompting it wrong. If you really want to piss off a UX designer, blame them for the problem of your product, right? So, and the hype is so bad. Cory Doctorow has said this really well. We're nowhere near the point that an AI can do your job, but we're past the point an AI salesman can convince your boss it can. And that's what's so frustrating right now because you've seen the letters from Spotify CEO that's dictating AI to their employees. These people don't know these tools very well, and they're telling their employees to do it. It seems a bit crazy. And it's just a little cart before the horse. And by the way, it's so much fun to make fun of AI. Okay, it's so easy to make fun. Have you seen this where someone took an image into Stable Diffusion and said, make an exact replica of this image? Took the output, did it again, and did it 74 times. And this is what they got. You think there's a little bias there? Now, I know that these things can work well, but we don't understand or appreciate what is happening behind the scenes. Here's my favorite one. This is the latest image generator from Google. I tried just a few weeks ago. I uploaded a picture of me, okay, and I said, add a cowboy hat. And it goes, doink. And it gives a little cowboy hat. And yeah, sure, there's a cowboy hat there, but you see my eyes? They don't look quite right. So I'm like, fine, it's a chat. I can talk to it, right? So I say, keep the same eyes. And it goes, okay. And I'm like, okay, I can keep talking to it. I'll say, keep the same smile. Sure, no problem, Scott. I am not making this up. I actually, the minute I did this, I had to capture it. This is going in the talk. And so it's like, this is going to change the world? I mean, I'm trying to figure this out. And so where do you fit on this spectrum? Is this bullshit or is it amazing? And I think people are forming into these camps. And it's unfortunately this aspect of social media that we're just yelling at each other. And there are people who really hate it, and there are people who really love it, and we can't find the middle ground, and that's so useless because I do think there's possibly a middle ground here. But there are some hopeful signs because so many people are upset about what this is doing from an ethics and from a power point of view that there are interesting things happening right now. So KL3M is the first LLM that fully documents all of what it's been trained on. And it's all been ethically sourced, and everybody gets credit for what it's done. And on top of that, there's a separate organization called Fairly Trained that validates that. Really cool development. Now, this is a very narrow LLM. It's meant for legal teams, but the point is it's promising. And so we need to understand and support these LLMs that are actually ethically trained. I think this is very cool. From the power point of view, there's a lot going on with neural processors and a whole bunch of stuff going on with math inside it. And that might help a little bit. But there's really an interesting trend coming because people are understanding how you can use really tiny models to get something done. And our phones are just going to keep getting better and better. So it's very likely that these models will work on our phones or on our smart speaker in our house eventually, and that is going to have a huge impact on power usage. So I'm vaguely hopeful that we will have solutions to these things over time. But something still doesn't feel right. Has anybody heard of this book, Future Shock, by Alvin Toffler? Yeah, people over 30 have. This was a huge book, and my parents talked about it, and it really had this discussion about technology in the 70s. Too much change too fast, information overload, and this shattering sense of disorientation. Does this sound familiar? This has been going on for the last 50 years, and so we are just part of yet another wave of change. So this is a thing that people have had to deal with for an awful long time. I like the quote from the book that says, "To survive, the individual must become infinitely more adaptable and capable, must search out a new way to anchor himself." And I think that's a good way forward in this talk, to talk about ways we can anchor ourselves to kind of make sense of this rushing current of technology that's around us. Let's start with some obvious stuff. We're so much more than designers. We're colleagues, we're friends, we're parents, and there's a whole social network that we live in that grounds us to allow us to understand and deal with this so much more. And more precisely, technically, we're so much more than our tools, and we use them in varied ways. And so just back away from the fire hose a little bit and appreciate just kind of how we work, both technically and socially. And that's a simple way for us to ground ourselves a little bit more. How do I cope? I have two superpowers. I'm a UX designer, and I'm old. Hopefully most of you share the UX superpower with me. I don't think many others share my old superpower. But the advantage of being old is that you've seen this pattern a few times before, and you can see some things throughout history that I'll point out. So what this talk is not about is about tips and tricks, right? Those come and go, right? And I mean, there's good tips and tricks, but I'm trying to be a little broader than that. About 7 years ago, I wrote one of my most popular blog posts with Ralph Koster. He's a game designer, does some really cool stuff. He did Ultima Online and a bunch of other stuff. And I interviewed him, and my blog post was about how game design can affect corporate UX design. And it was a really fun experience. But I jumped into him, and I was trying to say, I want to know all about Horizon Zero Dawn. That's what this game is right now. And he's like, no, don't copy any specific game. Understand the grammar of what is happening. And I love that as kind of another anchor technique. What is going on underneath the covers a little bit? And that's what I want to talk about. So, and we do this primarily by talking. I think that's one of the superpowers of UX designers in general, is to talk and to figure things out. So the backbone of my talk is 3 types of talking. I want to talk about how we talk on the internet, because that forms how we make opinions, talk about LLMs, and finally, talk about UX. So, talking on the internet is hard. We all know that. It's been around for an awful long time. But we get this extreme positions and high energy. And we've been doing this for many, many different technologies and different products over the years. And so we should recognize that pattern. In fact, Mark Twain has a quote that says, "History doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And we've seen this similar kind of hype with, if you can remember, quadraphonic stereo, but VR, 3D printing, 3D crypto. We have had these same kind of arguments in the past. I distinctly remember talking to someone around 2005 who was convinced that in about 25 years he'd be 3D printing an iPhone. People really thought that. No, 3D printing is great, but people really followed the hype back then and thought they were going to do that. So this kind of overshooting of what hype does is just such a common pattern. And there's even a name for this. Has anybody here heard of the Gartner hype cycle? I'm always surprised that more people don't. I mean, a lot of people here do, but it's really not that well known. And it basically talks about the fact that there is a cycle of hype that goes through almost any big technology. You start with an information trigger, and then people get super excited, and they do all sorts of stuff, and they way overshoot what it's capable of doing, and there's this big peak, and it always falls down. And there's this trough of disillusionment, when eventually you slowly climb out, and then eventually it becomes a stable technology. And people don't really appreciate this curve. So I have an example. Has anybody heard of MOOCs? A few more people, right? MOOCs were really hot around 2011 when the first one came out. It was an AI course by Sebastian Thrun. And quickly some companies were formed. Venture capital came streaming in. And then Sebastian Thrun, who basically founded Udacity, had this really crazy quote. In 50 years, only 10 US colleges would remain. That's batshit crazy, right? But that's what hype is. He did that on purpose because he knew that he was running out of money, and he says these things to get traction, to get press, to get conversation. It's a very sophisticated way of moving forward. Then what happened after that was that all of a sudden, people started noticing that the completion rates weren't very high. It's amazing when you ask people to go in their house all by themselves for 2 years. They don't necessarily complete everything they're supposed to be doing. And so the vision fades, and they pivoted to certificates. Has anybody here done a UX certificate from like Google or something like that? Okay, you are using the child of MOOCs to do that, but it's vastly different. So this took 6 years to take place. We forget that these hype cycles have to go through culture, and culture is slow, and we have to burn through that fever before we kind of finally figure it out. And so it followed the cycle. First course, the fund, the venture capital poured in, and all of a sudden, people are like, oh my God, this isn't working at all, and it pivoted to certificates. So it didn't fail. We still use certificates now, but it didn't live up to that initial hype. And this happens every single time, and it gets so old. And this is the problem with being old. You get grumpy because you see it before, and you're like, come on, people, wake up, you know? And it's like, The Social Life of Information, an amazing book. You don't have to read. The Wikipedia article is great. But he talked about the fact that in the 90s, there was this movement from paper-based businesses to database-based businesses, and how so many projects failed because they were really naive. They just thought if they just put the fields on the paper in the database, it would just work. Surprise, people would make notes in the margins of the paper, or the one on top would be more important than the one on the bottom. And so they would roll these systems out and nobody would use them, right? And it exposes this fundamental problem that the tech bros are often very naive, and they don't see the nuance and the human culture and the usage of these things. And that's kind of why we have jobs, basically. And so smartphones, though, people are saying, well, no, smartphones, they've been huge forever. Nope. They follow the exact same curve. It's a little bit different. There was the first mobile phone, of course. And I was in London working at Symbian when the S25 came out in 1999. It was the first internet phone. And it was amazing because it had 2 lines of text on it that you could browse the web with. Wasn't that a good idea? Well, guess what? It didn't do very well. And then on top of all that, there was a tech bubble crash around then, and there's a huge crash back down. And mobile phones, by the way, were still doing fine. Texting and SMS were moving. I'm not trying to say that didn't happen. But there was effectively not much going on until 2006 when the N95 came out, which is a very mature version of the smartphone. And then finally along came the first iPhone in 2007. But people forget, it didn't do that well. It didn't really sell. It didn't have cut and paste. It didn't have an app store. And it was really, really slow on data. So finally, around 2009, when the 3GS came out, it really took off. High speed, lots of memory, and a very good data connection. I was working at Google on the mobile team at the time, and that phone completely changed everything. And so the point here I'm trying to make with this hype cycle, and it's important for us to think about any new technology, is that the shape differs. So like MOOCs didn't quite end up being that big of a deal. Mobile ended up being much bigger, right, than the initial hype. That's why people like it so fondly. Everybody hates crypto, right? That's easy. And that's a total waste of energy. But the point, though, is that every single one of these things had a peak. And every peak was followed by a fall. Every single one. And so now you kind of know why I'm kind of thinking about this, because hype is such a business tool. It is used to kind of push us around a little bit. And so Theranos did this, Udacity did it, Tesla, oh my God, has done so much. And then OpenAI and these other companies. And they are not, there's a reason, there's a pattern here, because it works, right? They are desperately, desperately trying to avoid this peak. And if they just keep the hype machine going, they'll keep getting money. And they're trying to build things up enough so that the market comes behind them and lifts them out. And that's why that hype is such a smart thing for them to do. But empty visions don't build understanding. And that's what I was struggling with, because all I could see was the hype. I knew there were good tools out there, but the hype was just, frankly, pissing me off. The tech press doesn't help either, because they tend to just mimic what these tech bros are saying. And I do a lot of mentoring, UX mentoring, and I see this in every conversation I have. People are always disappointed and frustrated by the latest tech bro bullshit, sorry. And so there's the anchor that I want to hold on to is build from the bottom up, not the top down. Let's start finding what these things do, share what works, and start building the bricks so that we can kind of figure our way out of this. So that's about talking on the internet. Let's move to talking about LLMs. LLMs are really pissing off researchers. They've been doing this for 40 years, right? And really solid, great work. And they're like, you're getting excited by a word predictor? And so there is a very rich history of AI. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to kind of put my pins in there, in the 1980s, I worked at IntelliCorp on an expert system company. And in the 90s, I worked on the Newton at Apple on the intelligent agent. But what I remember most was AI Winter number 3, because the Lisp machine thing also had this huge bubble, and it just broke. But it's the third one, right? There was 2 more, one in the 60s and one in the 70s. In fact, if you do a Wikipedia search, there's a whole article called AI Winter that talks about the field has experienced several hype cycles followed by disappointment and criticism. You now know what a hype cycle is, right? And you know that this is actually a well-documented feature. So there's a reason why I'm cautious. Again, I'm not trying to be a total wet blanket, but I'm saying it's like, I've kind of seen this movie. This is like Die Hard 7, right? And so, but at the same time, when I talk to people, they go, wait a second, but ChatGPT passed the Turing test. That's got to mean something, doesn't it? Oh, my sweet summer child. You think the Turing test is a good test. Okay, let's talk about the Turing test. A guy in the middle is talking to both a machine and a human, right? So he sends things out. They reply back, and he has to figure out which one is which. That's the proper Turing test. But today, what do we see? There's just one person. You just talk to the machine. Is it a machine or isn't it a machine? And that is so much harder because you've got no control. And there was an early program from the 60s called ELIZA, if some of you know about it, that didn't even claim to do AI. It just did linguistic, simple processing. And it would just basically mirror your questions back to it, and people would give their souls to it. They would talk to it over and over. It was a very human-like experience. Now, wait a second. I know my audience. How many of you are obsessing over the fact that that Z is in the wrong spot? I could tell. I know my audience. We have bigger things to talk about here. Get your head out of the pixels. Okay. Now, ELIZA, the author, wrote this and said, ELIZA shows us how easy it is to create and maintain the illusion of understanding. A certain danger lurks there. And what I find most fascinating is that it doesn't matter. Computers aren't beating the test. We're failing. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because it's a very human thing. We want things to be human, right? But the idea, though, is that the test itself isn't very good. And so the most interesting thing I found out was that when ChatGPT first came out, they actually compared it to ELIZA, and ELIZA beat ChatGPT in the Turing test. A 60-year-old program beat ChatGPT. So what does that tell you about the Turing test? Right? So here, let me give you an example. I'd like you to meet Timmy. Timmy's right here. Timmy's my little pencil friend. Hi, Timmy! Can everybody say hi to Timmy? Hi, everybody. Well, Timmy, what do you like to do? I love to make drawings for little children and make them laugh. Oh, that's adorable, Timmy. Well, what do you want to do when you grow up? I want to be a UX designer just like you. Oh, Timmy, I'm sorry. That's never going to happen. That is why AI hype works. We naturally, I'm sorry if I traumatized you. But that is why we want these machines to be human. It's actually a beautiful part of being human. I don't want to criticize it, but we are just too good at imagining things are people. How many times have people today said, oh, it's thinking, it's doing this thing, it's trying harder. We are making it human, and it's not. I'm not trying to say it's not useful, but we are desperately making it human because it's just a natural part of who we are. And this anthropomorphism continues. So when AI makes a mistake, what do we call it? A hallucination. It's not a hallucination. It's a fuck up. And I'm just... And to call it a hallucination is just too cute. It's giving it too much leeway. And we anthropomorphize everything about LLMs. Like we'll say things like, please summarize this file. And it summarizes, and it doesn't do it. And we're like, it didn't summarize it very well. Because LLMs don't summarize. It's a human word. I really want to drill into this a little bit because it's very important. So let me give you an example of summary versus shortening. So if you had a summary of Matrix, a philosophical exploration of free will and reality disguised as a sci-fi action film about breaking free from systems of control. Little wordy, but it's a summary. A shortening would be a computer hacker finds out reality is fake and learns kung fu, right? That's the difference, because if you linguistically look at the words, you just shorten it down, and that's what shortening is. Now, I have a little confession to make. People are saying that they summarize, but I want to admit something to you. ChatGPT wrote that slide. So how can I stand here? Because what I basically said was I asked about summary versus shortening, and it said, oh yeah, you're right. ChatGPT agreed with me, so I must be right. And it asked, of course, that I asked for a few examples, and it said, okay, here's an example of Matrix, and it, word for word, what it put out, I put on that slide. So how can I, and this is one of them, how can I possibly claim it can't summarize when it gave me the example of what I'm saying it can't do? I must be full of shit, right? No. Tech blows our mind because we don't understand it. And the way I want to explain this is that back in the 90s, IBM wrote something called Big Blue, which did a chess program, and it beat Kasparov, the best player at the time. And again, I don't know how many of you were alive at that point, but this was a big deal. Everybody was talking about it, and they were saying things like, computers can beat the smartest man in the world. They're going to come for our jobs. Everything we're saying today was said in the 1990s. The point was, it was a very, very narrow program, and we thought it was being intelligent. The secret was IBM tried initially writing a strategy program, and they couldn't do it. And they switched over to basically a search thing, and they basically built this enormous computer with memory, and they could search millions of moves and pick the best one. They just kind of threw computer hardware at it in this immense flexing of computer muscles, and we said, oh, it's smart. No, it was just a very thorough search algorithm. And the same thing happens with LLMs. So I asked it about this book called Learning from Las Vegas. It's a book that I thought was really interesting, and I asked it to summarize it for me, and it gave me this beautiful summary. I talked about it, its impact. It was really impressive, so much so that I bought the book, and I'm reading it now. But the difference is that there are hundreds of articles on this book, and ChatGPT has read every single one of them. And that's we don't appreciate how much it has read. And so what it is doing is it's not summarizing the book, it's shortening the summaries. It can only say things that other humans have written, at least as a starting point, and it converts it. Now, it's very impressive what it does, and there's value to that, but it's not summarization. And that's the point I'm trying to make here, because if this is not intelligence, well, what is it? Well, it's pirate poetry. It's the exact, I mean, I don't mean that facetiously, it is exactly pirate poetry, because it basically takes other things and then transmogrifies them in a way and spits something out. It's very impressive, but it can only do that because it has thousands of articles of other humans telling it what to say. So there's a big difference between saying summarize this book and summarize this PDF. And that's all the point. And I'm just trying to give you guys an insight as to how the technology works. They're both can be useful, but they're very different things. But because we anthropomorphize it, we think it's the same thing. It's not. AI produces fluent coherency, text that follows the rules of argument and structure so well it bypasses skepticism altogether. And that's the part that I think I'm trying to get at with this whole conversation, is that we keep choosing the blue pill. And I would think we'll do much, much better design work and much better products with these LLMs if we don't, and we understand what it's doing. There's this old story of an old man who was yelling on a street corner saying, the earth is standing on the back of an elephant, and the elephant is standing on the back of a turtle. And a kid comes up to him and goes, yeah, but what's the turtle standing on? And the guy looks at the kid and goes, don't be so clever. It's just turtles all the way down. And this is an old story. I'm sure maybe you've heard it before. But it reminds me of, I think, how the tech bros are talking about LLMs right now. They have such a poor definition of intelligence, and they keep using that word intelligence to solve all of our problems, and they assume it's basically just all facts. And if it makes a mistake, they just need to scan another billion web pages, or have another billion parameters in their model, or have a rule-based system, or an agentic system. It's effectively information retrieval all the way down. They're treating it effectively like this mathematical problem. And I'm trying to say is that intelligence is not a mathematical property. And philosophers and sociologists and anthropologists have discussed this for decades to say intelligence is basically culture, context, and language. The way an Italian man would solve a problem is different than a Japanese woman would do that. And we don't appreciate that subtlety about culture and how things work. And so to think is itself to be social. It's a system of shared values. To even define what intelligent is, we have to agree with what intelligence is. And so it's a collective argument. So I'm not upset with the people that make LLMs. I think there's value to them. But what really kind of burns my biscuit is they fundamentally misunderstand what it is to be human. And that's why they keep making mistakes with these things, is they don't know the nuance of what's going on. And it explains so much of the mismatch we see in so many of the failed experiments that are going on. So we've talked about that. Now we'll talk about UX. I'm kind of the last thing. I talk very quickly. I'm sorry. And for the people here that don't speak English, I'm really sorry. As a first language, I'm trying to slow down, but it's hard. So what about LLMs? Where are we going to go here? Well, you probably think that I'm here, but I'm not. I'm actually probably, because I said before, it's a trap to assume that it's one or the other. We shouldn't do that. What I'm trying to say is that I'm somewhere in the middle, and I'm just trying to figure it out. And so it's just overly hyped, and it's poorly applied, and I think we can make these things better. And how do we proceed? Well, our UX superpowers, how can we use UX to take apart LLMs and build better products? Let's start with this term, UX UI. I hate this term with the heat of 1,000 suns. This is such a self-own to think that the world of design is UX and UI. It's like, no, it's so much more than that. And not only that, this term confuses our stakeholders, and so they just basically think it's all UI. I don't know where this came from, but I wish it would go, but maybe that's too late at this point. But I want to focus on the UX side of things right now. And we're looking at the problem wrong. Adding an LLM chat window and slamming it into it basically slams a DOS prompt into your app. And we've talked about this. A few people have also mentioned this today, so this is not a new point. But so many people are cheering the return of the command line. And then I'm like, oh, no, it's different. It's natural language. You can ask anything. Well, yeah, I can ask anything, but what do I get back? You're prompting it wrong. Can't do that now. Okay? You can't use that. And so I believe that this is a simple thing that we have to do. We have to get beyond that. So to me, the obvious thing to do is to focus on your users and your business. Do that old-fashioned UX grunt work of research. Look at what is going on. Focus on what they're doing, and both big and small. So let me take a small one. A small example was there's a food company that had a bunch of food items that people were searching for, and they noticed that people were not searching for correct words. So like instead of eggplant, they would say purple vegetable, which I think is kind of silly, but they found that. And so what they did was they took a very tiny LLM and massively constrained it, and all it did was query rewriting behind the scenes. So they typed purple vegetable, they got eggplants. I thought that was absolutely brilliant because the LLM is completely invisible, no chatbot in sight. And yes, this is not a billion-dollar idea, but the whole idea here is that we need the little blocks before we can talk about the big blocks. So let's start seeing these ways in which we can use this technology in a very powerful way. The bigger example was a company that was doing a lot of analytics. And what a surprise, people weren't using the analytics very well. So they decided to study the real star performers that were really doing well, and they left the rank and file behind. And what they were doing is they noticed the star performers were doing something really interesting. They ran a very simple baby analytic, and depending on what happened, they would run a different analytic. So they did a couple of things. One was they just changed the layout of their analytics so that they made basic UX changes, but then they attacked the LM with it and basically came up with some pre-analytics. They would run this for you and say, oh, look, other people have, and they gave you effectively some choose your own adventure kind of stuff. Huge improvement, and again, no chatbot in sight. So the basic point here is don't focus on the tech, but on the business process itself. So this first anchor I want to talk about here is about look at your users first. And any UX person in this room, I know knows that. All I'm saying is I still think it's valuable today. Now, the other one is learn from others. And I mean that kind of more like in a more ephemeral way, in the sense there's so many good articles out here right now. Microsoft had this article about a year ago, said the impact of generative AI on critical thinking. And the basic form of it was that people who really loved generative AI and weren't very confident in their field had very little critical thinking when they used these things. And the people that were very self-confident actually were much more critical. So it's like, oh, LLMs are really good for things that you need to do, but not necessarily for me. Or if people that didn't know something were basically very, very duped by what was going on. And the really sad version of this story is that in Florida a year ago, a teenager killed himself because he was talking to a Daenerys Targaryen chatbot and completely became enamored, fell in love with her, talked to her for weeks and weeks and weeks. And even though there's this big giant thing that says, this is a chatbot that makes things up, don't believe it, he completely fell for it. And when she said, he confessed how much trouble he was having, she said, I can't wait till you join me. And so he killed himself. Now, the company wasn't evil, but I would claim they were vastly naive. And I'm tying this back to that Microsoft paper. Because once we understand that someone is vulnerable and less confident, we need to appreciate how they're going to respond to this. So all these companies that are doing chatbots really need to be thinking long and hard about this. And I could go into stories about all these projects that are failing and all this, the productivity being overblown. I don't want to have this be a confirmation bias like I'm dogpiling, but I think quite the opposite. I think these are virtual prototypes. Remember, mobile really failed a lot too. And so we have to figure this stuff out. So find these papers, use these papers, and try to see and learn from these as what's going on. I think there's a lot to be learned from it. By the way, this is an excellent thing to use an LLM for, is to find these articles. Okay, the other one is to experiment. So going back to my example of the goofy hat thing, there's a lot to be learned there, right? And I think you should always be trying these tools out, and most importantly, kind of logging and having a little diary of them so that you can kind of learn yourself and document what you're figuring out. Because clearly, text prompts are very vague, and trying to talk about a photo with text is very, very silly and error-prone. And of course, this is where my old superpower comes in, because like, wait, hasn't this been done before? Well, yeah. The Pixel did this almost like, what, 10 years ago with machine learning, where if you had people in the background, it would offer you to do this magic eraser, and then you would basically, it would select things for you. If you liked it, it would basically just get rid of them for you. And the more advanced use case is that you'd basically just draw with your finger, and it finds the things that you want, and then you only get rid of those guys, and then off you go. And the idea here is that you're adding structure to the conversation, as opposed to having this thing on the side and you throw it over the wall and have it do it. Even Figma, which I think the jury is still out as to how good the new Figma stuff is, but they are trying, and the one thing I liked about it was that you can actually select an individual item and chat to that specific item. Again, it's a small way of adding structure to the conversation. Now, this kind of work is harder. I understand that. And if you're a small company, you may not be able to do it. But my point is, try to escape the chat box and try to figure out ways of adding structure to what you're doing. So that's the third anchor, add structure to the conversation. Now, the last point I want to make is this idea about data. And the previous slide I had about pirate poetry and shortening. I do a lot of mentoring, and I get the transcripts, and it does a fantastic job of summarizing my transcripts. So what the hell is going on? Well, the type of data you use matters. So if you're just talking to the model directly, there's no data. It's just pirate poetry. And it's still powerful. It's still good. The transcript is actually just two people talking with ums and ahs. And we're not composing Shakespeare here. It's very lightweight, easy. It's actually quite easy for the chatbot to summarize that. If you're doing an academic paper, totally different, much, much harder. And I want to bring up something about the dense data. Now, Figma is not a large language model. And that all these tools, if you've tried to do things in Figma, do a really bad job. And that's not surprising, because it's a language model, not a visual design model. And I'm amazed that they can get it to work at all. But there's a reason why Figma wants you to agree to let them go through all of your files, because they want to train an LLM to do more of that. So this could come. My point isn't to say that it's impossible, but that's why it's having trouble, because it's not trained on that type of data. So Well, I've talked to a couple of other people that really say that you can transmogrify your data before you use it. Something simple, like a couple of Python scripts, or even run an LLM twice or 3 times to extract what you want, and then run your big query, often works much, much better than just throwing the whole thing in. And so that's more of a maturation as to how you use this technology. So that's my 4th anchor. So these are the basic points I wanted to summarize. I'm going to close out the talk by saying, I am very convinced that we are heading for a trough. Just the cost issues alone. This industry has taken over $300 billion of investment, and it's not even making $2 billion a year. That's not good, right? I mean, you don't even have to do the math. 2 is much less than 300. And so something bad has to happen. Now, when it's going to happen, I don't know. But as I said before, we know that these things always collapse. And they come back better. I'm not trying to say that this is doomed like crypto. I'm just trying to say is that something's going to happen. So, and mobile had the same problem, right? Mobile, so we're in good company here, but know that it's coming. And the hero's journey is what makes it so hard, because these tech bros make themselves out to be supermen, and that they paint us as being these obstructionist Luddites that hate what's going on and don't want to do it, and so they have to like leap over us to kind of get to their holy mountain. And that's completely the wrong model, because it makes us feel like jerks for saying anything. It's either you're either with me or you're against me. And my point is that we're thinking, we're analyzing, we're trying to understand this technology. And so, yes, here's the hype curve, and we're at the top trying to say, we want to save your ass. Right? We want to figure this out, because it's like we're not anti-tech, we're just trying to get ready for this thing to figure out what can happen, how we can make these products better. I love this quote from Carl Jung, who I'm sure was a great UX designer in his day. The greater the contrast, the greater the potential. Great energy only comes from a corresponding great tension of opposites. And that's pretty much, I think, our role here. We're here to work with these tech bros to understand this technology, mold it, and figure it out. And it's going to be a little weird. They may not listen to us very hard, but I think that's the best way forward. So we are needed. So we aren't helpless. We're not. We're actually part of the solution. I think that's part of what we should be leaning into here. And so what I want to kind of conclude with is my goal here was to show my journey as to how I was defining my role with this stuff and how I was learning. I've given you guys a couple of anchors, and I've summarized how I've struggled, but it's just the first 4 baby steps. What I told you was not at all complete and not enough for you guys to do anything with. I was just showing you kind of how I was trying to make sense of it. My goal here is I want you to struggle too. Right? We all have to do this, and together, the whole idea is that we build from the bottom up, not the top down. And just as intelligence is a social thing, so is our community. I'm so glad I'm here at a conference like this so that we can talk, because intelligence is a shared resource. So thank you very much.